Star Wars is definitely not Wuxia. Hey everybody, Deathblade here, another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ, and another video under COVID-19 lockdown. It could be loud if my son is yelling and screaming or possibly bursting in, who knows. Actually, if you're gonna talk in that vein, I would say The Mandalorian.
I need to go poop.
Today I'm doing a video on Star Wars and Wuxia, and as you saw in the introduction, I've noticed over the years, especially in the last few years, I've seen more and more talk online about people saying that Star Wars is Wuxia. Maybe it's Wuxia for white people, or it's Wuxia in space. And so today I'm going to be doing a video to debunk that, because that is not true at all. Now, I'm a big Wuxia fan, obviously. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I like both of them, and there are similarities between the two of them. There are also a lot of people online who point out the similarities or the influences, and that's totally fine. There are a lot of those. For instance, there's the master-apprentice relationship that's in a lot of the movies, and that's definitely something you see in Wuxia. There's also the fact that the Force is very similar to Qi, or the internal energy that gets used in Wuxia novels. And of course, the sort of acrobatic combat style that's especially prominent in the prequel and sequel trilogies definitely has a very Wuxia vibe. And over the years, I've heard things that imply that Lucas lifted inspiration from Wuxia movies. For example, it was at a Comic-Con panel in probably the early 2000s that I heard supposedly George Lucas specifically showed his people a scene from a kind of obscure Wuxia movie called Moon Warriors, and he said to emulate or even copy that movie scene for use in The Phantom Menace. And I'm going to show you very quickly the similarity between Moon Warriors fight scene and the Duel of the Fates fight scene between Darth Maul, Qui-Gon Jinn, and I was about to say Ewan McGregor, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. So check that out right here. So there's obviously some similarities between the two, but that said, Star Wars is definitely not Wuxia, and I'm going to explain to you why. Now, before I get too much into the video, I want to preface it by saying I'm not going to compare Star Wars to xianxia, to the cultivation stuff. If you're unfamiliar with the difference between Wuxia and xianxia, of course I have a video about that. But basically, I don't think xianxia is as much in the mainstream consciousness as Wuxia is. Although xianxia is very popular now in terms of what people are consuming, it still has not yet reached the level of cultural impact that Wuxia has. And I have not seen very many people comparing xianxia or xianxia or the cultivation novels with Star Wars. I would say that, however, the main principles are the same. There are definitely some similarities. Definitely, there's no way that George Lucas modeled Star Wars, or any of the creators of Star Wars modeled any Star Wars stuff off of the cultivation or xianxia stuff, because that has only become popular in the past maybe year or two. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break the video into two portions. The first portion, I'm basically just going to list out some common stuff that you see in Wuxia movies and you read in Wuxia novels that you will never see in Star Wars. And I think that's kind of good evidence to show that Star Wars is not Wuxia. Then I'm going to talk about 5 things that basically have to be in a Wuxia story or a Wuxia movie in order to make it Wuxia. And again, Star Wars lacks those. So that top 5 is basically going to be the coup de grace, I guess, to prove definitively that Star Wars is not Wuxia. Of course, incidentally, this video actually does serve as sort of a big introduction to Wuxia as well. So if you're not familiar with what Wuxia is, or you only just kind of have heard the name but don't really know much detail about it, this video will actually help a lot. Okay, so let's get into it. First, I'm going to list out some Wuxia tropes that Star Wars does not have. Now, a lot of these tropes don't necessarily appear in every single Wuxia movie or Wuxia story, but they appear so frequently that I would say they're sort of they would count as defining characteristics of the genre in general. For instance, number 1, there is usually a proliferation of a lot of different kinds of weapons used by the characters. Now, obviously, the main characters are often swordsmen, or they'll use a saber or a spear. Those are probably the most common, but there's always characters with those. There are actually 18 different types of common Chinese martial arts weapons, although that list of what those exact 18 weapons are kind of varies. And so whether it's the protagonists, the villains, or the cannon fodder guys, you will see all kinds of different weapons in Wuxia, whereas in Star Wars, I would say that other than the lightsaber and the blaster, it's not like you're seeing all different types of crazy, weird weapons. Obviously, there'll be stuff thrown in there here and there, but not as much as in Wuxia. Another thing about the weapons that you see in Wuxia is there are often named weapons that are the subject of envy by people who don't have them. They want to hunt them down and find them. Star Wars having a named weapon is not necessarily a big thing. You know, Luke Skywalker's lightsaber isn't called like Sith Killer killer or something like that. Wuxia novels oftentimes are connected to real life history, that being the real life history of China. Obviously, there's no way that Star Wars can do that. In Wuxia novels and Wuxia movies, you're going to often see alcohol play a prominent role. The heroes will drink alcohol a lot, they'll use it to form bonds with other people, and they oftentimes have a really big alcohol tolerance. That's kind of like one of the things that is seen to be heroic in the Wuxia novels. Obviously, drinking alcohol is not something that you're going to see in Star Wars. Another thing you'll see, this is kind of a negative trope to some extent, and that's overly beautiful people. So this is especially prominent in the novels where they will describe women in these just extremely hyperbolic terms to describe her as being beautiful. You know, she has skin like jade and all these different things, and that sounds really flowery and beautiful in Chinese. And in the TV shows, I think they do try to reflect that by having the lead actresses all be super beautiful. And that's not to say that there aren't pretty people in Star Wars. Obviously, you know, Slave Leia is a big thing. And if you're the younger generation, I'm sure, you know, there's a lot of young people like Natalie Portman, and point is there's pretty people in Star Wars, but in Wuxia they kind of ratchet it up a notch and have them be really, really beautiful. Again, not something you see in Star Wars. Other things, needles, poison, martial arts manuals. These are all things that are super common. You don't necessarily see them in every single Wuxia thing, but never in Star Wars do you see those. There's also trope characters that don't show up in Star Wars. You have the young master all the time in Wuxia novels. There's also like the old granny characters. I know that's not necessarily a genre feature, but you see them in enough movies and enough stories to kind of come to expect them. Those being these like kind of old shriveled women who turn out to be super powerful martial artists. Now there are some old grannies I'm specifically thinking of in the sequel trilogy. There was one specific character, I forgot her name, that was in the first movie. But that said, generally speaking, it's not something that I'm expecting to see in Star Wars. You also have themes of patriotism that are really common in Wuxia. A lot of times the heroes view themselves as being Han Chinese and they're loyal to the current dynasty, or perhaps to the previous dynasty and they're rebelling against the new one that they view to be a usurper dynasty, perhaps foreign dynasty. And the heroes in Wuxia stories are often described as the type who will fight for their country. That's almost always viewed as a positive thing, again, unless they're subverting a usurper. That's not really something you see in Star Wars. In Star Wars, you do have the Republic, and the Jedi are working for the Republic, kind of. And in the original trilogy, the rebels are trying to, you know, fight against the usurper. So there is some connection there, but I feel like it's more of a practical thing in Star Wars as opposed to, in the Chinese mind, it's something that goes beyond practicality, and it's something that because of the Confucian values that are so deeply rooted in Chinese thinking, I think it's a lot more fundamental to the Chinese psyche that people who are heroic would be fighting for their country. Finally, another Wuxia thing is you have the lone wandering hero. Now this doesn't happen every single time, but often the main character will be an unaffiliated roaming martial arts master or swordsman, and that's really a big genre trope that you see all the time, and that doesn't really happen that much in Star Wars. The Jedi are dispatched by the Order. They're not just kind of wandering around doing their own thing, you know, being a rebel, so to speak, against society. In that vein, I would say that the Mandalorian actually does come pretty close to that. He's a bounty hunter, kind of wandering around doing his own thing. That to me is very Wuxia. But again, if you're talking about Star Wars in general, I think that's something Star Wars is missing. So moving on to section 2 of the video, I'm going to talk about 5 things that I think you have to have in Wuxia stories and Wuxia movies. Now I will put a disclaimer in there. Occasionally you're going to come across movies or shows that might be missing one of these, maybe 2, but for the most part, these are the defining characteristics of Wuxia that you really have to have a Wuxia story. Number 5, we have sworn brotherhood. So occasionally this will not come up as a prominent plot point, but a lot of times it's kind of just there in the background, sort of stated or maybe implied, and occasionally you will come across a movie or a TV show that doesn't have it. But that said, sworn brotherhood is a really important thing. I just did a video about it recently, you can check out here if you want. Essentially, it's when 2 people enter into a formal relationship to make themselves siblings of a sort, not blood siblings, but they swear an oath to heaven and earth, and then that binds them together for life, and they're supposed to be completely loyal to each other. So again, I don't really see this happening in Star Wars. You do have strong bonds that form between people. Maybe you could cite Han Solo and Chewbacca, but that's definitely not sworn brotherhood. And you do have close friends in the various movies. There's no thing where they get on their knees and then swear an oath to each other and then call each other brother from then on out. Or it could be sister, as I mentioned in that video. Number 4, this is a huge driving force in so many Wuxia movies. I would venture to say all of them, but I didn't spend the time to like literally go through lists of like hundreds of movies and stories and like think about it deeply. But revenge. Revenge is a huge thing in Wuxia. Sometimes the entire plots of movies are all driven by revenge. You killed my master, you killed my family, I will now have to kill you, kill your family, whatever it is. Sometimes the subject of revenge will get stacked on top of each other, even within one movie. So, it starts out with this person seeking revenge to get revenge, and then people on that side now have to get revenge on this person, and kind of goes back and forth. It's a huge thing, and that is not something prominent that I see in Star Wars. Number 3 thing on the list of top 5, that's martial arts styles. I mean, this is something that is in virtually all Wuxia movies. You have people from different organizations or families, they have their own style of martial art, and it's visually obvious, and not only visually obvious just as they're fighting, but sometimes it's important to the plot. People from Shaolin fight this way, people from Wudang fight this way, and then this person is superior because they have this different aspect of their martial arts. This person is better because they have this different aspect of their martial arts. And that plethora of martial arts is one of the defining things about Wuxia that you just don't see in Star Wars. Now, I know that different Jedi have different fighting styles. That was something that came up in, I would say, the prequel trilogy. And, as a young person watching the prequel trilogy, I thought it was really cool to see the Jedi on the battlefield, and they're like fighting different ways. Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan, had his little lightsaber flourish or whatever, and then different Jedi would have, different colored lightsabers and different fighting styles. But it's not as though they would be going around talking about that, and that wasn't really an important element. It was just kind of a cool thing that was thrown in there to make it look cool. It's not as though Qui-Gon Jinn was like, okay, Obi-Wan, I will now teach you my 4 forest 7 star slaying lightsaber style or something like that. It's not a thing, as opposed to Wuxia, where that is really a big thing. Number 2 thing that Star Wars lacks that Wuxia movies and stories almost always have, that is sects and clans. So various organizations that revolve around martial arts, or to whom martial arts are extremely important, who then interact with other organizations. They oftentimes have wars with each other, or if not, at least the fact that those organizations exist are important to the story. Now, again, this is another one where it's not as though every single Wuxia novel and movie has this for sure, absolutely 100%, but it's almost always a really important aspect. And there are the famous organizations, some of which I mentioned earlier, such as Shaolin and Wudang and Emei. And when people travel around, they will identify themselves as being from this organization, or people will recognize them as being from this organization, perhaps because of the type of weapon they use or the clothing they have. Definitely not something really that you see a lot in Star Wars. There are obviously different groups of people. You have the Rebellion, and you have the Imperial Forces, and you have the Bounty Hunters Guild or whatever. But it's definitely not to the same level that you see in Wuxia novels. Finally, the number 1 most important thing that Star Wars lacks, that every single Wuxia movie or novel features, and I, again, take that with a grain of salt. I didn't do a scientific analysis of it, but the Jianghu is extremely important. Now, if you don't know what Jianghu is, in a word, it's basically the martial arts underworld. Or it's not necessarily, I would say the martial arts aspect is a section of this sort of underworld of people that exists outside of the bounds of normal society and away from the reach of the central government. It's a really complicated topic that I'm going to do a video on another time. But suffice to say, there is no Jianghu in Star Wars, and you have to have a Jianghu for Wuxia. Even if the Wuxia novel and movie doesn't specifically mention Jianghu, it's there. Sadly, if you're a person who watches a lot of Wuxia movies, whether they're Shaw Brothers movies or whether they're the more new school Wuxia movies, a lot of times, in fact probably most of the time, the subtitles and the dubbing do not mention the Jianghu. They leave it out or they translate it as something else. But trust me, it is in pretty much every single movie. So to elaborate a little bit, this Jianghu will feature the martial artists that are part of the movie, and also other people that sort of are outside of normal society, whether that's the beggars, maybe the prostitutes, corrupt government officials and whatnot. Now, a lot of times people from outside of this Jianghu will participate in it, and the people in the Jianghu will to some extent interact with people that are outside of the Jianghu, for example, talking to the innkeeper or passing citizens or whatever. Wuxia stories essentially take place in their own world that is separate from the world at large. Now, I know that there is an underworld element in Star Wars, obviously, but the thing is that Jianghu doesn't necessarily inherently imply criminal stuff, whereas the underworld in Star Wars, where you have the Hutts and you have the bounty hunters and you have the smugglers and stuff, they're just kind of a subsection of the larger Star Wars universe, as opposed to Wuxia, where it's all Wuxia takes place in the Jianghu. So if Star Wars was, for example, if Star Wars was only The Mandalorian, and that type of subculture, then you would have a much stronger case to liken Star Wars to Wuxia, but that's just not the case. In the films, the underworld elements, the criminal elements are part of the story, but they are not the story. And again, the Jianghu of Wuxia does not imply criminality. Sometimes the people in the Jianghu are criminals, but it includes everybody who is essentially operating on their own code of conduct that's different from that of society at large. So I hope this video was informative for anybody out there who is a fan of Star Wars and a fan of Wuxia. I think that the assertion that Star Wars is Wuxia comes from a little bit of ignorance on the part of people who say that. Perhaps they are people who like Wuxia movies, kung fu movies, and they've seen similarities between the two, and so then they declare, oh, well, Star Wars is just Wuxia. This is especially true of the sequel and prequel trilogies. As Wuxia became more of a part of Western film culture, those kind of tropes seeped in, especially the acrobatic combat style. But just having an acrobatic combat style or high-flying action doesn't mean that Wuxia and Star Wars are the same thing. And when you're talking about the original trilogy, that's definitely even much less connected to Wuxia. I do know that Lucas lifted a lot of elements from Westerns, samurai movies, and whatnot for the original trilogy, especially the fight scenes. Those fight scenes are obviously much more reminiscent of stuff that you would see in samurai movies as opposed to Wuxia. And that's not even to mention the dog fights that you have in space with X-Wings, Y-Wings, TIE Fighters, and whatnot. Obviously that's inspired by a much different type of movie. So what are your thoughts? Please do leave them below. Do you disagree with me? Do you agree with me? Do you have any more points? I want to say thanks to Brendan from Bedrock Games and also Wuxia Rocks on Twitter, who helped me a little bit. I wanted to make sure that I had some outside input to make sure I wasn't missing something or interpreting something incorrectly, and not that they agreed with 100% everything that I said, but they did provide some input, so thanks to them. I'm sure there are other people out there who have thoughts about this. Please do leave them in the comments below. If you like this kind of content, do like and subscribe. I also have a Patreon. You can find all of that in the description below. I'll see you in the next video. God's love. Ewan McGregor, Ewan McGregor. If Ewan McGregor ever watches this video,